it's very, very difficult to punish a player for using these cards because the decks aren't really reliant on them. It's just that if they aren't dealt with early, they're going to carry the game for the player who's using them. The last thing I want to mention actually, it's not really the last thing, but another thing I want to mention, which falls into a different category, is the quote unquote mill deck. It's not really a mill deck because it doesn't force a player to draw their whole deck or burn their cards or anything like Magic or Hearthstone mill decks do. But this deck, the Infested Abomination style deck that is going to be recycling spontaneous combustions and Tibats and just trying to blow up the board over and over, really locks a lot of decks out of the game. It's, in addition to being really annoying and kind of a toxic deck, it completely shuts down certain archetypes, which this is kind of the opposite of like Chlor, Rita, Agent Coil, Mechborn, the Aether Acolyte Tinker combo stuff. Instead of generating a lot of pressure really early, it can lock a player out of the game really early and keep them locked out very early. So it's like the control version of that effect instead of the aggressive version. And there's very little counterplayer. If a player doesn't have the right deck or it doesn't have the right sideboard, it can be almost impossible to beat this sort of deck. And like I said, certain decks just have an outright huge disadvantage against it. The last card I want to talk about is the Calamity, which I think also locks a lot of decks out of the game because the deck that it hurts the most, the kinds of decks that it hurts the most are decks that build up a large board, like a mid-range kind of deck, or like even a slow stompy deck, like Warpath in particular, I think is a good example. They just get brutalized by this card to the point where sometimes it's impossible to recover from one Calamity, let alone multiple if the person recycles it. Admittedly, the Calamity does do a good job of giving control decks an option to kind of take control of the game very late in the game. It rewards a control deck for hitting the late game, but it's oppressive to certain deck archetypes. So anyways, those are the cards and decks that I think are going to be locking other decks out of the game and other cards out of the game. Like, you can't have a deck that just builds up a massive board state and wins very slow as long as the Calamity exists. You can't have any fun as long as this Infested Abomination deck exists. But believe me, every time I lose to Flame Dawn in Ranked, I come back to this deck. This deck completely hoses Flame Dawn, and it's amazing. So if you're a salty dog like me, whenever you lose to Flame Dawn, that's the way to go. And then like, you know, Chlor, Rita, Agent Coil, Mechborn, and the Aether Acolyte stuff. These cards that generate so much pressure early on with such a low opportunity cost are going to lock a lot of other cards out of the game, because if the card isn't going to generate as much early game pressure as those cards, it's hard to justify using them. And for that reason, I'm concerned that the meta might not change much. With that being said, when the dust settles, if the meta has not changed much or at all with the release of Rebellion cards, I think it's time to look into changing some of these existing cards that I have mentioned, or putting nerfs into the decks that I have mentioned, just to give the other cards and other decks a chance to shine a little more. And I'm going to very quickly go over potential nerfs that could be done. Chlor is a particularly rough one because he's a legendary. He even locks new players out of the game in addition to other decks and cards. So seeing any kind of Chlor nerf would be good for game health in addition to game balance. And what I would want to see to encourage slower decks would be to just blow his morale cost through the roof. Make him, like, when he dies, the player who kills him should really feel like they've made progress. Whereas right now, if you kill Chlor, all you really get is you get to wipe your brow and then prepare yourself to get pounded by the other Flamed On characters. It's just that if you don't kill Chlor, you probably lose. So increasing the morale cost to something like 15, I think would be appropriate, would give any slower deck some feeling that they've made more progress when they kill Chlor. Another possible nerf to him, which I don't like as much because it really is a much bigger change than increasing his morale cost, would be to make him triple purity. Because I don't think triple Flamed On is nearly as abusive as 2 Flamed On 1 Sleepers or 2 Flamed On 1 Veror. And that would be an okay change. I like the morale change more, but heck, you could even do both of these changes. Moving on, let's talk about Agent Coil Mechborn. Similarly, he has such a low morale cost. It's unreal. For such, like, it would be good, I think, to increase his morale cost. I don't think you can really justify changing his purity because every other Agent Coil is 2 purity. So for thematic reasons, well, that's not an Agent Coil. But for thematic reasons, I think you have to keep it at 2 purity. But increasing the morale cost would be one thing. Another thing would be to add an exhaust to the pay 1 effect, or to make it so instead of +4/+4, it was +3/+3. I think my laundry's done. Anyways, I think any of the changes I just suggested would be pretty reasonable to Agent Coil Mechborn. He's not nearly as bad as Chlor in terms of locking players out of the game as a legendary, because I do feel that there are other viable Genesis options, particularly Alita Immortal Tinkerer is very good and super easy to get. Comes with the campaign. So yeah. Quickly, I want to mention that you could try to nerf Agent Coil Mechborn by targeting his last effect, but once again, every Agent Coil has this dragon effect, and I don't think it would be good to change this one's. And in addition, it's worth noting that this clause almost never is relevant. If Agent Coil Mechborn has survived until turn 10, you are completely screwed anyways, because he's probably bigger than the 25/25 dragon is anyways. So I think you're screwed. Now we got to talk about Rita. Rita's a tough one, but what I think is, so I think having a token generator in the command zone is okay, and I think it's good because I want there to be token decks as an option. I think being able to generate characters is good. I think 1 purity is appropriate because you want to be able to have a diverse number of decks that can take advantage of this effect. But things that could be done, one would be the 2/2s only have 1 morale cost right now. Increasing it to 2 morale would actually be a pretty big nerf to the card. It would be subtle. I think it would be pretty elegant. It would actually force a player to think about churning out these tokens every turn because it would put a much more imminent limiting reagent on how many you can make, because as of now you can make literally 100 and they can all die. Well, I guess you could make 99 and they can all die without you dying, whereas if you increase the morale cost to 2, you could create a maximum of 49 of them. And of course, these numbers are not really what's really going to happen because there's going to be other characters in the deck, but I think that would be good. And you're noticing that I'm talking about morale a lot because like I said, I want to slow the game down, and I want to give something like Descendants of the Dragons a place to actually shine in the meta, or something like Sleepers, or even just a Warpath deck that ends up going on defense because you have no other option against Flamed On, the Flamed On Veror combo in particular. Other change, two more that are possible, and like I said, we can incorporate as many of these changes together as we want. One is a 5/15 body with this effect is ridiculous. The deck that I was using for a while, and I still use sometimes, Rita churns out characters, and then when I'm sick of her, or if I need to have defense now, and I can't wait to churn out tokens, the 5/15 body is a very good defender for a card that's supposed to be a utility character generating characters through, the paying 1 effect. So changing that to like a 5/10 would be pretty big. It would make her also much more vulnerable to damage effects while she's in the command zone. Speaking of which, the last potential change I want to mention would be to Rita Shadow Priestess almost gets barely any play. It's definitely not nearly as competitive, and it's not like a command zone card. One thing that could be done that might boost the level that Rita Shadow Priestess is and reduce the Mistress of Shadow one would be to swap their second abilities. This one sacrifices a character you control, she heals 5, and this one is she takes damage dealt to her and redirects it to the guards. And if you switched those, that would first of all make some sense because Rita Mistress of Shadow spends most of the game in the command zone, whereas Rita Shadow Priestess is generally not going to be in the command zone because she doesn't have the effect until she's deployed. And putting the more combat-oriented effect onto the one that's more likely to be deployed makes a lot more sense to me. It's also definitively the better effect, in my opinion. I have cheesed so many people with this effect. It blocks Unstoppable, and it also it can eat entire assault zones of small characters. She doesn't need this effect to be good. Like, they could even just take it off completely. They don't even have to replace it with sacrifice a character. She heals 5. Like, it's just such a good effect. She doesn't need it. Getting rid of it or replacing it with heal 5 would make a lot more sense. And Rita Shadow Priestess could use that little buff. And I think she would work a lot better if she had that ability instead of Mistress of Shadow. All right, and the last couple cards we got to talk about, or decks, Tinker combo, and this is a tough one because it's not like any one card is causing the problem. I don't know if increasing the morale cost would be reasonable. I think it's like a reasonable morale cost right now, but one thing that just could be done to nerf this deck that would be pretty effective might be to increase the purity of Tinker to 2. So it doesn't actually hurt the deck that much in terms of what cards are in it. Admittedly, the cards it's losing are pretty important, but the biggest thing is that you can only have one Aether Acolyte in the command zone, which is obviously huge because it means instead of there being 2 giant 2-cost characters, there's only 1. Another possible change would be to make it so Aether Acolyte only gets +1/+1 when it is deployed, which would really hurt this deck's speed. Maybe too much. It might go from tier 1 to like bad, just like bad if you did that. Last change would be just to take it down to a 4/4, so then it dies to Lightning Blast, but I don't know. Like I said, this is a tougher one when you're looking at entire decks instead of specific cards, but I do think the card to target is probably Aether Acolyte. And like I've been talking about purity increases, we can't increase this to 2 purity because that obviously does nothing here. So it's a tough one. And let's talk about the mill deck. This is even harder because you might think that the abusive card is Infested Abomination, but I win most of my games actually with Lin Bao's Will, because game 1 I sometimes win it with Infested Abomination, but most players are carrying Grave Rob or Purify to handle this deck specifically. So I try to win through morale most of my games, actually. Grave, why do I keep doing that? Grave Rob. You guys know what the card is anyways, I don't have to search it up. But, so it's very hard to say what to nerf, because you might think this card is the one to nerf, but I don't think it is. And it's one of the things that's really abusive about this deck is that not one specific card is good. It's just that the combination of being able to get so many of these AoE damage effects is just so good. Honestly, I think the card that might deserve the nerf most would be Tibat. He's just amazing. I don't know. A lot of things could be done. His stats could be changed. They could reduce the damage he does. They could even take off Vigilance. I want to mention that this guy, unfortunately, you can't really nerf him by increasing the morale costs, because the decks that are abusing him the most are not using characters that have high morale costs, or really any characters at all. As you can see, I only have 10 characters in the deck, so increasing his morale cost doesn't actually hurt this deck that much. It would hurt other decks that want to use Tibat much more than it hurts this deck. So it's a tough one. It's a real tough one. And then, actually, while we're here, I want to mention that, like, one nerf to this deck might actually just to be make Martyr Golem more frickin' available, because Martyr Golem is a card that is super, super good in a lot of decks. It's very easy to put in a sideboard. I think it's very good against this kind of deck in a lot of cases, but its rarity actually does have an impact on the meta, because not every player has access to 3 Martyr Golems. The most experienced players do, but I actually only have 2, and I've been playing for a very long time. This card hurts new players. That's all I wanted to say. It hurts new players a lot to not be able to get access to a very staple card without investing a ludicrous amount of money in the game. Admittedly, this promo one helps a lot because you can get one guaranteed with a lot of other good stuff. So I'm really glad that they did that, but it's a rough one for new players. And then lastly, the Calamity. Super hard card to change, because I do think that rewarding slow control decks with the ability to kind of put a hard stop into aggressive decks attacking is important. But it, like I said, hurts the mid-range decks more. I think one thing to do would just be make it so you can't recycle this card. Either by making it so it removes itself from the game and you can only play 1 per the game, or really just, the point is the card shouldn't happen more than once per game. And if let me just explain what I mean. If it happens and wipes out a player's whole board, if that player managed to build up their board again, they deserve to be able to win without having to worry about the Calamity happening a second time. It's just too brutal to the slower, mid-rangey kind of decks. All right, so I've talked about everything. I've expressed my concern that the meta won't change much. We will have to wait and see, because it's going to be a while to see what kind of decks are going to be strong afterwards. But that's my prediction, is that a lot of these tier 1 decks are going to remain tier 1, and it's because how quickly they take control of the game, either by doing what this Millish Infested Abomination deck does, which is it locks players out of the game extremely early, or like the Chlor, Rita, Agent Coil, Mechborn, Aether Acolyte, Tinker combo cards, they put so much pressure in the early game that they take control of the game too quickly. So I'm looking for cards that are going to slow down the game, or cards that are going to open up new deck archetypes. And if that doesn't happen, I think some nerfs are appropriate, and the ones I mentioned I think are worth considering. Anyways, while we're here, we might as well mention that I've got 100 subscribers now, or a little over 100 subscribers. So thank you everyone who's supported the channel. It means a lot to me. 100 subscribers for this game, as small as it is actually a very big deal. So I appreciate it. Anyone who's been here from the beginning, you're awesome. And anyone who joined just a week ago or whatever, thank you for joining the team. And until next time, guys, peace out.